For many men, it can be hard to know exactly what role we can or should play in working towards an end to sexism. How can men help, and how much or how little should we be helping? In this video, we will explore answers to those questions and share a few suggestions about how men can respectfully approach feminism and, critically, explain why it's beneficial for men to be involved. First things first, because there's so much misinformation about feminism floating around out there in the cultural ether, it's useful to quickly define what that term actually means. Feminism is a socio-political movement with the central goal of ending sexism and dismantling gender-based oppression. So contrary to common misconceptions, feminism is not about man-hating or female supremacy. It's important to note that the feminist endeavor, as it's been defined by women like Bell Hooks, does not simply seek equal access for women within current systems of power, but instead seeks to transform those systems and the values associated with them. So where do men fit into all of this? Well, women have long been pointing out the ways in which men can benefit from feminism, and actively calling for men's participation in working towards ending sexism. As Bell Hooks writes in her landmark 1984 book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, like women, men have been socialized to passively accept sexist ideology. While they need not blame themselves for accepting sexism, they must assume responsibility for eliminating it. Men are not exploited or oppressed by sexism, but there are ways in which they suffer as a result of it. That bears repeating. Men are not exploited or oppressed by sexism, but there are ways in which we suffer as a result of it. We are taught early on that boys don't cry, that to show sensitivity or emotional vulnerability is a sign of weakness. Men are discouraged from practicing nurturing, caregiving, compassion, and compromise for the same reasons. So there is an enormous amount of pressure placed on men to prove our manhood by acting tough, projecting strength, and repressing our emotions. This is compounded by the fact that men are often more admired for being aggressive, dominant, and violent than for being cooperative, vulnerable, and empathetic. Not only is all of this damaging behavior encouraged in individual men, but those same values are also reflected in our larger political and military institutions, often to disastrous effect. So while men as a group are afforded gender-based privileges at the expense of women, a byproduct of patriarchy is that it also causes real harm to men's well-being. Okay, so if we're on board with ending sexism, what specifically can we do as men to be helpful? Here's our quick list of 5 tips for respectfully engaging with feminism as men. Listen to women. Now that might seem really obvious, but far too often men have a hard time just listening to what women have to say and respecting women's knowledge and experiences. Because of the way we're socialized to think of our voices as most important, men have a tendency to interrupt and interject ourselves into conversations and then to dominate those interactions. This behavior is so ingrained that men often don't even realize we're doing it, which is why it's critical to learn how to take a step back, to try not to interrupt, and instead actively listen and absorb what is being said before responding. Now, of course, this does not mean you have to agree with everything every individual woman says. No one person's perspective can ever represent all of feminism or the experiences of all women. It simply means that we, as men, are not in a position to define feminism for women, and that we should actively pay attention to women's voices, because for so long, women's experiences, women's perspectives, and women's ideas have been dismissed, ignored, and silenced. It's especially vital to listen to women of color, particularly Black and Indigenous women, because, as feminist scholars have long pointed out, sexism is compounded when it's combined with racism and other forms of oppression. Back in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality as part of her theory to describe these layered experiences that leave some women more disenfranchised than others. It's important for us as men to acknowledge that when we talk about feminism, we follow the lead of women. Yet while feminist ideas do originate with women, that does not mean that it's the responsibility of every woman to teach all men about sexism. So we shouldn't go around interrogating or demanding answers from women. Instead, we should be proactive in doing the work ourselves by committing to continuous, lifelong learning. Lucky for us, over the past century, feminist scholars have written volumes on the topic. So here are some suggested readings about feminism and how patriarchy operates as a social system. Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks is a great place to start, though definitely put The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love at the very top of your list. Sociologist Alan G. Johnson's book, The Gender Knot, Unraveling Our Patriarchal Legacy, is also essential reading, as well as This Bridge Called My Back, edited by Cherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa. For those interested in something written in a more academic language, check out Masculinities by R.W. Connell and her follow-up book, The Men and the Boys. The place where men can be most helpful in regards to feminism is first within ourselves and then amongst other men. Patriarchy encourages men to buy into sexist thinking and at the very least remain complacent in sexism through our silence. So instead, step off the path of least resistance and dare to make yourself and other men uncomfortable about sexism. Let the other men around you know that their sexist behavior is not okay. For example, when you stand up and say that a sexist joke is not funny, the men telling that joke can no longer be assured that they will go unchallenged the next time they tell it. In other words, those men can no longer count on other men to accept or go along with their sexism. Interrupting the sexist status quo is a simple yet powerful way that all men can make a difference. If you make a comment and a woman dismisses or disagrees with you, don't take it personally. She doesn't owe you anything, and her disagreement does not necessarily mean that she's angry or frustrated with you as an individual. That being said, it's completely understandable for women to express anger about sexism. Sexism should make everyone angry. After all, most women have some first-hand experience with violence or harassment or mistreatment at the hands of men. Sometimes even men who claim to be allies. So don't get defensive if individual women don't want to engage with you. And remember that it's definitely not our job to police the ways that women may choose to speak about sexism or their experiences. Men's support for feminism should not be seen as some kind of favor to women. As we've discussed, dismantling the system of sexist beliefs benefits people of all genders. And moreover, men shouldn't expect a reward for deciding not to participate in a terrible system of oppression. Or, as many feminists have said before, you don't get a cookie for being a decent human being. It's really hard to break years of socialization overnight, so messing up is inevitable. I've certainly made my fair share of mistakes. The key is what you do next. We always have a choice in how we respond to our mistakes. So be humble, examine your own actions, acknowledge failings, and continue to learn how to be better and more supportive. Sexism is not necessarily something always done consciously. It's something we're socialized to think is normal, and as such, it's something we often participate in without even meaning to. This is why challenging ourselves and reflecting on our own actions is a vital step in the process. But remember to be compassionate and patient with yourself, and keep working at it. This is by no means an exhaustive list of advice, but it should give you a place to start. Now, if you're feeling a little uneasy at this point, that might actually be a good sign. As men, the process of honestly re-examining our own assumptions and questioning our participation in sexism will often feel uncomfortable. But remember that even though we as individuals didn't create the system of patriarchy, it does manifest itself in almost every aspect of our lives, which means we do have a responsibility to challenge it. We must always recall our potential for positive impact in the world, and be involved in this work not out of personal guilt or shame, but because, as we've discussed in this video, the desired outcome is ending gender-based oppression and making the world a better place for people of all genders, including men.